Hi everyone, how's it going? I'm Hannah Nyron. I'm the digital marketing manager at the MIT Press. And today we have a very special guest, Paola Bonifacio. Hi Paola, how's it going?
Hi, good. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you for joining us. You're calling in from Austin, Texas, is it?
Yeah, I'm here in Austin, Texas. I'm an associate professor in the Department of French and Italian. If you don't know me, I work primarily in film studies and gender studies. My first book, Schooling in Modernity, it's a study on documentary films produced and sponsored by American and Italian information agencies after World War II to advertise programs of reconstruction and modernization. I'm also associate editor of the peer online review journal, Gender Sexuality in Italy.
Fantastic. You sound very busy. We're lucky you had time to write this book.
Well, actually, thank you everyone to be here. I know that the Zoom time these days is very precious, so I really appreciate it.
And thank you for joining us. So to get started, we're here to talk about your book, The Photo Romance. So tell us a little bit about The Photo Romance and what inspired this book.
Yeah, when I first started working on this project, I was really struck by the contrast between the popularity of the magazines and the basically lack of scholarship on them. So for those of you who are not familiar with photo romance, I have a few photos to share. These are photos from the book. This is a copy of Bolero Film, a magazine published by a very big company in Italy, Mondadori, and was the first magazine to use the term photoromance, in Italian fotoromanzo. And in English sometimes you hear the word photonovel. I prefer to use photoromance because that was the word used by American magazine, Darling and Kiss. They were the first to import Italian photoromances in the US. You may have heard the word fotonovela in Spanish and Portuguese. So this photoromance is a type of comics that use photographs instead of drawing. And as I said, they were extremely popular starting in the late 40s to the mid 80s. They were born in Italy, but then spread all over the world pretty quickly. They were very successful in France, Belgium, throughout Europe, and then especially in South America, Brazil, Argentina, also in Central America and Mexico. So there is a very sharp contrast between what was an extreme, great success. We're talking about millions of copies sold per week only in Italy. And on the other hand, either a dismissal in scholarship, given their status as low culture, or really a sharp criticism and derogatory criticism, particularly, in Latin American cultural studies. Photoromances are considered as tool of cultural domination, of indoctrination, and especially indoctrination of women who were the target audience of these magazines. As you can see here, the title Dishonor, so these are mostly stories about romantic relationship. They draw from the tradition of pulp romances and of film melodrama. So what I was interested was to kind of move beyond this criticism. And what I did first was I started reading the magazines. And as I was reading them, I realized that actually the publishers in those early years of the late 40s were already innovating the market by enabling certain dynamics that are now typical in contemporary media culture, what we call media convergence. So as you can see here, already the medium itself converge different other media. So comics, photography, film, but also the magazines, they were a big container of different media products. So they were tool of advertisement for the music industry, for television. The photoromances, for example, cast as actors and actresses, film stars, or TV celebrities, or even singers. So from the point of view of the stories themselves, they were basically functioning like today we have this term transmedia storytelling. So they were drawing from other medias to create narrative worlds. but also the companies themselves, so the publishers were establishing business connection and synergies with other media industries, or they were themselves integrated firms. So for example, Mondadori owned their own record label and would use Bolero Film to advertise songs, or would use singers to sing that song as actors in photo romances and actors in photo romances. So this kind of innovation were what kind of drew me and brought me to think that it was really worth studying more the photo romances as media products, and so to understand their place in media history. But the other thing that I wanted to do was to try to understand what was the role of readers in the success of the industry. So as I said, the sharp criticism against them was mostly due to the fact, was based on the presumption that readers were just passive, naive, and so they were indoctrinated by these romantic stories and by the cultural industry. So what I wanted to do was to understand more instead what was their active role in participation in the making of the greatest success of the photo romances worldwide.
Great. So you did tell us a bit about the history of the photo romance, but how early did the popularity of the photo romance as a medium start to rise?
So the popularity, as I said, was due because of the many connections between the industry of the photo romance and that of other media industries. One of what I do in the book, I look at the photo romance as a cultural phenomenon. So I cover quite a bit of ground. And one aspect that in particular the book is about is the connection between photo romances and films. As I showed you before, I'm going to show you another image. Photo romances were mostly about romantic stories of romantic relationship, and these were original stories. But also many of them were, they were based on films, and so they used film stills and photographs from films to create these stories. And so here you can see clearly the connection with the film industry was really broad. And the pictures that I show are also kind of a way to show how the transnational aspect and that was, at the basis of that popularity is pretty much, explained here. On one end, you have a photo romance that is based on a Hollywood film, so is a way for Italian publisher to appeal to film viewers. And also the photo romances were used both as advertisement for films and as a way to basically have readers read a film when they could not go to the movie theater. The other example is a photo romance based on an Italian melodrama in French, very famous Italian melodrama. So that was at the basis of their popularity, right? The fact that they could play on the taste and the appeal of other media through the media itself, right? Through the medium itself.
So it really extended to a lot of different countries. It wasn't just Italian, it was in the US and France. Where else were the photo romances very popular?
Right, yes, and as I said, especially in South America as well. And then they came in the United States in the mid 70s. Another aspect that I cover is the fact that their popularity, despite the fact that, as I said, in the public debate, they were considered as low culture. Their popularity was so that eventually the medium was used by the very same critics for political purposes, for example. So the very good example is, very sharp criticism was from Catholic and communist press. And then the Catholic magazine, a very famous Catholic magazine, was also publishing photo romances by the mid 50s. And the same for the Italian Communist Party that eventually used photo romances as a medium for trying to convince women to vote for the party at national elections. So their popularity is also shown by means of the fact that they really expanded beyond the market into also other fields, right? Other areas and other spheres.
And you talk about its correlation with politics and religion. Um, do you think that the photo romance might have contributed to women's oppression?
Well, so as I said, the criticism against them is based on a culture and gender hierarchy. So it's based on association between these productions, this cultural production, and the feminine gender. This is something that is not unique to the photo romance and was actually pretty much spread, not just in the late 40s and 50s, but through history, if you think about the criticism, I don't know, of film melodrama. So this association between a certain genre and a certain gender in derogative ways, it's not unique to the photo romance, but it's very peculiar to it in the way in which photo romance are really at the rock bottom of cultural hierarchies, right? And so this kind of association between gender happens in various phases, right? And at the beginning, basically the female audience is, as I said, identified as passive, as stupid, as a very easy receptacle for indoctrination. And then later in the 1970s, photo romances are accused precisely to contribute to the continuation of women oppression. And so therefore attacked not only by, not only by Catholic, not only by communists, but also by the radical feminists of those years. So one of the goal of this book for me was to understand what was the role of women as active participants in the industry. On one hand, because the success of the photo romance was based on the fact of the existence of a female public. In the post-war period, more and more women become consumers, right? So one thing that I say in the book is that, for example, a magazine like Bolero Film was not born a woman's magazine. It became one. And it became one because Mondadori understood that the audience of women was that made the large amount of population was made by women consumers, right? And so in that sense, what these magazines were doing, they were basically exploiting, right? What was the changes in the social and economic constitution of the different readership in the different countries. And so in that sense, what I do is I try to understand how, as readers, instead, women participated to the industry, for example, by the practice of fandom, right? And the practice of fandom is what create among women a collective identity. So the idea is that there is a criticism that's focused on the text and is focused on the ideology of narratives of what the photo romances allegedly say to women. But there is an aspect, that is the collective aspect of readership, of exchanging stories, of talking about them. That is what makes, I think that is what the most interesting one, and then the one that allow you to reread the history of the photo romance from the point of view of women. One of the chapters of the book is about contemporary fans of photo romances. And the reason why I talk about contemporary fans is because, unfortunately, we lack the data about the readership of the 50s or the 60s. So what I do is I study today's social media. And there are a lot of Facebook groups of fans of photo romances. And on these Facebook groups, most of the users are women who used to read photo romances in the 70s, for example. And it's interesting to see how for them, so what I did in the book, I collected through surveys and through kind of an ethnographic study. I became members of these Facebook groups, and I gathered data and I shared information with these fans to understand how precisely they saw the reading of photoromances as part of the building of their personal identity as women, but also a way to create connection with previous generations. So, you know, with their mothers, with the mothers of their mothers who were sharing stories, they were sharing the magazine themselves, so that, you know, from the point of view of the act of reading, there is an aspect that it's much more progressive than what critics would like to describe. Also, the other you know, the other consideration that we can make about photoromances that are, if you would read them, let's say from a feminist perspective, is how they speak of what today is called post-feminism. That is, what they speak of a way of developing like female emancipation that is very different from that of radical feminism, right? That is grounded in consumerism, that is grounded in consumer culture, but that has a place itself in the history of feminism plural, right? And that today is labeled as post-feminism because it's connected very much to contemporary society, but actually has a much longer tradition, and it starts precisely right after World War II with the spread of modernization and the changes in the gender roles and the sexual liberation of the 60s and 70s as well.
Fascinating. It's really interesting how something that's dismissed so often as lowbrow culture or quote unquote trash culture can play such a role in culture overall.
Right, but you know, I think what the photoromans tell us is also that you know, history, the way in which history is written, right, it doesn't necessarily correspond to objectivity, right? It doesn't necessarily correspond to how you know, it gives you one way of understanding historical development, right? And there's a lot of things that are excluded, right? So as a cultural phenomenon, as I said, you know, millions of copies sold per week means something, right? It means that there is clearly a response from popular audiences towards these media that cannot just simply be dismissed because of the fact that we understand the audiences as passive and basically not able, right, to make their own decision. There is a quote that I have in the book by the editor of Bolero Film, in which he precisely, you know, argues right into Mondadori that to be an editor of a popular magazine is one of the hardest things because readers can very well abandon you for another product, right? And therefore, there is an understanding from the point of view of the industry that readers are not passive or stupid, right? But they're very much active users. They're loyal customers. And these are all kind of terms and things that are very much understood when people study and consider contemporary media culture, but for some reason, they have not been you know, taken into account when considering older media products like the photoromans.
Yeah, and I think that maybe from a contemporary audience today, the photo romance wouldn't seem as lowbrow or forgettable because it's now a historical medium. But what about what are some pop culture icons or mediums today that you think would be comparable?
Well, more than comparable, what I think is really comparable is in terms of dynamics of production. So as I said, the photoromance as an industry is a precursor of what today we call transmedia storytelling. So today we're very used, for example, to the fact that a film comes out, then a TV series come out afterwards. Then you have, you know, various different products that are connected to the production, to media production. So they are media convergent. Convergent culture is because today we're used to the fact that these all come out at the same time. And therefore they can attract a variety of audiences, right, from different kind of media sphere. And that's what the way in which the photoromance is a precursor, right, to digital media, because the publisher were precisely playing on the fact that they could build loyal readership by attracting this kind of nomadic reader, right? A nomadic reader who would be interested in film, would be interested in music, and would find in the photoromance everything that she needed, right? The gossip about the film star, or the advice from the film star on how to be, the perfect housewife, and at the same time, how to become a star, right? So in terms of female readership particularly, the appeal of these magazines is that they basically acted as a way to suture, on one end, the desire of a female reader, for example, to enter the show business, and on the other hand, the kind of traditional instead expectation for this female reader to become the perfect housewife, the perfect mother. In this sense, it's also where we can see how, from the point of view of female readership, really the magazine were shaping female identities according to what now is called post-feminist culture. That is a way of combining, on one hand, the feminist gains of sexual liberation, right? And these magazines were criticized by the Catholic critics because they were too sexually explicit, because they were stories of adultery, which did not chastise women for having affairs. So on one hand, they were really promoter of the sexual liberation, starting from the 60s especially, and then in the 70s. And on the other hand, though, they conveyed a type of gender model that was very traditional. And so therefore they promoted, for example, the ideal of the perfect man or the perfect husband. So these kind of contradictions that are present in the photoromance is another way in which they anticipate contemporary pop culture, and especially, something like the girl, the chick flicks. So the kind of gender models and the ideas of femininities that were promoted in these magazines very close to that of contemporary media culture that represents women.
Yeah, and it really hasn't changed that often the feminine targeted methods of media are the ones that are seen as like the least the least impressive or the least artistic.
Yeah, one thing that I talk about in the book is also the fact that photoromances, because they were a new type of medium, they weren't as censored as other like film. So one aspect that I talk about in the book, particularly when we are looking at photoromances based on films, the way in which the photoromance would rewrite a story of a film would be much more risque, or much more possibly it could be possibly censored, right? But they were not because they did not have any kind of protection in copyright. They were not really controlled by the government the same way in which film could be controlled. So in that sense, they're also a very good example of thinking again in terms of how they anticipate contemporary media. There were a space where it was much more possible to have so-called grassroots extensions. That is, for example, some of these photoromances based on films, they use a pirated copy of films to make the photoromance, and they could rewrite the story because they did not really need, the publisher did not really ask for permission from directors or producer, right? So they were really like they could be homemade production, the same way in which today you could have fund-based remaking of films, but they would go very much they would be put down from the internet immediately, right? But in those years, they were not really protected or controlled. And so there was much more space for fans to really appropriate the medium itself by rewriting, for example, films by means of photographs.
Right, and in some countries, copyright laws aren't as strict as they are in the U.S., where most of our audience is.
Right, yes, that's very true. That's that was especially the case in Europe as opposed to the U.S. Right. So actually, in the 1970s, a couple of entrepreneurs opened a publisher that published. They were called photonovels. So they're photo romances based on Hollywood films. Right. I have some examples here. This one, they had to ask permission from Hollywood majors in order to make the photonovel, right? But in Europe, instead, copyright laws for films were different with respect to the US. There was much more freedom, but the problem in Europe was much more vis-a-vis the director, because the 50s and the 60s are the time that the so-called auteur film, and so you would have photo romances based on film by very famous filmmakers like Michelangelo Antonioni or Federico Fellini. So a film like La Strada was turned into a photo romance in a way that really changed the plot, changed the story, used the story as a way to showcase, the film star, Anthony Quinn, rather than focusing on the ability, quality, and style of the director. So for the European context, the way in which the photo romance was, going against the establishment, because by that time, in the 60s, then these filmmakers auteur were the establishment, right? And then in that sense, these are product of popular culture, not only because they're popular, meaning that they have a very wide audience, but because they are a reworking, right, of what is the elite culture from the point of view of readership. So if, for example, you would have a film by, I talk in the book, about the way in which a film like Senso, directed by Luchino Visconti, or Terminal Station by Vittorio De Sica, so very important film, very serious films, right, are remade into romantic stories or melodramas. So they're remade in a way that goes against the very serious or the intention of the author of the time.
That's really interesting. So you showed us one of your books, but I know for a fact that you are a photo romance collector.
Oh, yes.
So
actually, that was another reason, something that drew me to this project. My previous book I mentioned, Schooling Modernity, was about these documentary films that kind of got forgotten in archives. And what I did in that book was really to replace them in the historical context in which they were produced. So to a certain extent, this project is similar. Because photo romance, like those documentary film, we can call them orphan objects. So basically, these are these magazines, because of the fact they were not considered they were not considered culture, right? They have not been stored in libraries or archives. So there are very little, some archives have some cine romances, so some photo romance based on film. Mondadori has its own archive, but for the most part, these are lost objects. So part of the project was that to kind of find these objects, right? And so I became a collector also because there was no other way for me to study them but to buy them, right? So, and most of them are, believe it or not, there is a huge market of photo romances on eBay, right? And actually, I'm very grateful, to collectors because it's thanks to them. So again, it's only thanks to the fans that we have now access to photo romances. They're still sold today in Italy. They're still sold today also in France. But really their popularity ended in the 1980s. And so unless fans themselves kept copies of them, we would not have access to them. And as I said, there are a lot of these Facebook groups And one of the role that these Facebook groups play is that of what we can call rogue archives. So basically, because these private people have collections, then they digitize the collection and put them online. Again, against any kind of copyright laws, because most of these publishers don't exist anymore. So the very big publisher Lancho, that was very popular in the 70s, closed in 2011. And so right now, the only really the fans are those that make accessible to us that material, right? And they actually they see themselves as such, right? So there is an understanding of themselves precisely as those who are responsible for keeping fanship alive, fandom alive, but also of delivering that kind of history, right, to a wider audience.
And how many of the books on your bookshelf do you think are photo romances?
Oh, so the photo romance are all magazines, right? So I should have specified before. So they were only published in weekly or monthly magazines. So I have collected, hundreds of them and had to put them in nice little folders to make sure that they stay. The example of the American photo novel is the only example of photo romance that were published in small booklets, right?
Oh, okay.
But are all published in magazines, either weekly or sometimes monthly. But yeah, not on books, right?
Magazines. I mean, magazines makes more sense anyway. I just saw a couple of those little booklets and I thought there were more.
Yeah, no.
All right, great. So we have a couple questions in the Q&A. Quite a few. So the first one's very long, and they say, "Ciao, Paula." So they either know you or
very friendly face. So
yeah, or they're very friendly. I'm curious about this point you've made about women and the public sphere. I'm wondering if in your research and with your past work, if you think the photo romance as a medium and genre might serve as an example of a generic construction of a certain kind of quote unquote intimate public, and Lauren Berlant's use of the term from The Female Complaint, where the term indicates mediums and genres where its consumer participants are perceived to be marked by commonly lived history. Its narratives and things are deemed expressive of that history while also shaping its conventions of belonging. That looks a little bit like a thesis to me, but it's a long question.
Actually, the way I end the book, so sorry, I'll try to see whether I can answer the question, but first I wanted to say that, I really see this work as a work that hopefully will trigger more research to be done on the photo romance. So my goal was really to, I have, another scholar, Jan Beitens, who's author of a book on the film photo novel, is the only other author who has really addressed this aspect of transmediality and this aspect of convergence culture when speaking on photo romances. But so the idea was that precisely that of beginning to think about it in ways that could trigger further research. So I'm very happy if, the talk or the book can start new ways of writing about the photo romance. I would say that the way I look at the readership of photo romances, and so the female readership, I'm not sure I would use the term intimate. I mean, to a certain extent, as I said, I think that photo romance has a twofold effect. On one end is that of participating in the self-construction of female identities, that, as I said, is based on a common and shared practice of reading photo romances. And in that sense, has an intimate, feature in the way in which it happens within the space, within the domestic sphere, right? Within the space of one's room. At the same time, though, I really think that what the photo romance tell us is about the way in which in way which the magazine function with respect to female audience to open up precisely this readership to the public sphere. So in that sense, they are exploiting a market of female readers that want to move beyond, right, a certain understanding of their gender or femininity, and precisely become protagonists of the public sphere. So in that sense, I think that the effect of these magazines are a little different. That answered the question.
Yeah, I think that answered the question. And I also love that you casually dropped in the middle of that answer that there's one other scholar in your field?
Well, there's some, as I said, for many years, the photo romance have been dismissed, either from, in cultural studies because of the critique of the cultural industries, and in media studies because the medium itself is considered as poor because it's recycling other media. But now today, of course, we have an understanding of recycling that is very different, right? So this idea of originality, of course, doesn't really have much of a role when studying a medium like the photo romance. But for the most part, scholarship, again, concentrate on the cultural aspect of the photo romance in a very narrow way, without bridging into media studies, which I think what this book is trying to, this is what the book is doing, right? Is trying to understand photo romances both as a cultural phenomenon, and so their meaning within the context of Italy, but also understanding the photo romance as a transnational cultural phenomena, and therefore the importance of it within the context of global media history, right? And so not only for the Italian readership, right, but for a global readership, and for what it means in terms of the way we understand how media are, how media industries function, or functioned in the past.
Right. Yeah, as someone who rewatched 22 Marvel movies this summer, I can vouch for the fact that recycling is very in.
Yeah. Yes, very much. Yes. And also today, as I said, there are a lot of these fans on social media that, many of them are readers from the past, right? And so they use today's social media as a way to recollect in the past and precisely continue working on that process of construction of identities, right? But some of them instead are contemporary readers that appreciate the kitschiness of photo romances and read them with a certain distance. Perhaps I myself, I am, part of this group, right? And even, as I said, the pleasure of collecting lost objects, which I think is very contemporary as well.
Great. So we have a few more questions. People are getting excited now that they know we're answering them. Victoria, your editor, Victoria, has a question. She says, hello, Paula and Hannah. I'd love to hear more about how controversial topics like abortion were often first broached in photo romances, and how that conversation drove public discussions on the same topics. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, thank you, Victoria. And I don't know how to thank you, because really, Victoria was, of course, my first point of contact with MIT Press, and I was really, really happy that she was so much engaged with this project. I owe very much to her what the book is now. So yes, that's something that I kind of just touched briefly before. The fact that because of their popularity in terms of, as I said, the fact that these are commercial products, they are less under the inspection and control, particularly in Italy, of the state or the Catholic Church. And the same, could be said for realities outside of Italy. And so they could talk about topics that were taboo in society, and therefore contribute to an awareness of these topics among readership, right? So for example, they could talk about divorce in a country where divorce was not the law, right? Like Italy. And as a matter of fact, there was an awareness also from the point of view of the publishers that they were precisely kind of going against what was the rule, right? That other media industry had to respect, such as the film industry. And the point, to the point that at the same time, organization like the birth control movement in the 70s in Italy understood that photoromances were the medium that was most effectively to be used to talk to women about controversial topics. So for example, in the mid-70s, as I said, the birth control movement in Italy that was connected to Planned Parenthood in the United States used photoromance to advertise the use of contraceptive pill. And they use the photoromance not just as a medium, but really as a in the way in which they use celebrity, they employed celebrities to create these photoromances, to spread and invite women to use a contraceptive pill at the time when really that was prohibited by the moral code of the Catholic Church that was still very strong, and the patriarchal society was still very strong in Italy at the time. So in that sense, yes, the photoromances, particularly for female audiences, were a place where they could even just become aware even of certain topics that they would not have access to otherwise.
And we have more questions about the association of the photoromance with government and things like that. So here's a follow-up question. Are there similar examples of quote unquote women genres or female genres popularized in Italy during fascism or in the liberal period that informed the conventions and production of the photoromances in the post-war period?
Yeah, I mean, the influence with past form, as I said, is very important for the photoromance. And we can even go back, farther back to the 1800s. As I said, there are connections with the feuilleton. And, speaking of abortion, for example, Raffaello Matarazzo, the director that I showed you the photoromance before, the one with the woman with the two faces, the White Angel, was the director of melodramas starting from the fascist period, so starting from the 1930s. And already film melodrama were tackling this kind of taboo issues. So there is a melodrama from before the war directed by Matarazzo that's precisely talking about abortion, right? So in that sense, there is a very strong connection in terms of narratives with the pre-war period. And I would argue that yes, more work should be done to understand how also in the pre-war period already popular, so pop romances, for example, by the very famous writer Liala, that were also inspiring the photoromance production of the post-war period, were opening up towards, they were a place where female readers could find a place to go beyond the restricted, gender roles in which they were confined already in the pre-war period. But what I think is different here, though, is that what publisher in the post-war period exploited was really the changing in the market, and the fact that, so there is a way to talk about photoromances in the criticism, that is, photoromances are stuff for female servants. So the derogative way in which this expression is used is actually a good way to understand how the target audience was that of lower classes and women. So in that sense, this is a term that wants to diminish the importance of the magazines, but at the same time, we see that these are for women of the lower classes, the readings at the time, and the place where they can participate and develop their identities through the reading of these cultural products. So it's used in derogative way, but as a matter of fact, what the cultural industry were doing then, so the publisher were doing it, is understand the importance of this market. So, I have no misunderstanding here that publishers were targeting low income classes and women because they knew that there was a market there. So there is a survey from the mid-60s done by Mondadori with the Doxa Institute in Italy that was basically, that was meant to understand the kind of purchasing power that these low-income classes had. And as a matter of fact, was much higher than expected. And so many women were buyers of photoromances, not just readers. And that, that meant that could be also buyers of the products, of beauty products, of, house cleaning products, anything that was advertised on the magazines as well, right? There is this aspect of the connection between the developing of the media industry and the changing in the economy and in society throughout Europe after World War II. That's really what makes the difference beyond that kind of drawing from an older tradition from the point of view of narratives.
Great, thank you for sharing that. So we have two versions of the same question next. To what do you attribute the drop-off of popularity in the 1980s?
Yes. Well, as I say in the book, some people argue that the drop in popularity is due to the rising popularity of television, right? So once we have soap operas, we don't need photoromances anymore. Or we could say, and that's what I say, that soap operas are the legacy of photoromances. So, right, rather than saying, one medium is replaced by the other, we could say that there is continuity there. In terms of, again, how soap operas are draw from the traditional photoromances themselves, right? But yes, I mean, to a certain extent, that is one of the reasons. And then there are also practical reasons that is meaning that there is a general drop in interest and in magazines. So not just photoromances, right? But magazine production are not as successful anymore in the mid-80s. But definitely, as I said, I called before the nomadic readers of the photoromances. So in the mid-80s, a lot of these publishers, they were publishing the magazine that closed, or they sell to smaller like Mondadori sells Bolero Film in the mid-80s, and they transition to different kinds. So they move to different kind of media products, right? And therefore they transition to something else. And then there is a legacy of that though in television production at the time. For the photoromances based on film instead, their popularity ends much earlier. It ends in the mid-60s. And there we could make a claim that it's really about the changes in the copyright laws that happened in those years. And the fact that very soon this pirate producer of photonovel or film photonovels are busted, right? And so at some point in the 60s, that production ends. And I would argue more for kind of legal reason than any other.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point about the soap operas on TV and just generally the amount of options available on TV in the 80s. I mean, having a TV became so ubiquitous in the 80s.
Right. Yes. But I mean, there is a certain, so There are also differences. I've mentioned before the small publisher Lancho. This publisher is different from others. As I said, they exported in the mid-70s in the US, and they continue to produce photo romances up to the 2011. And the reason why they continue to be successful also through the 90s, so they are an exception in this sense, it's because they created what we can call an object-specific fandom. So as opposed to most of other photo romances that, as I said, they build fandom by connecting the photo romance to film, television, and the music industry, Lancho created a type of fandom that was really specific not only to the medium, but to the series themselves. So the actors and actresses playing in these photo romances became, in their own way, of course, these are not, if I tell you names, you won't know them, right? But they became very popular for this very specific readership of magazines, and therefore were able to then continue and survive even after the mid-80s. And they're still, as I said, even though the company has closed in 2011, they're still very popular and very much read, thanks to the fans online and on social media.
Great, and we have a lot more questions, so I'm going through to see which ones are we should answer first. Well, Victoria added that, fun fact, the book is lightly modeled to echo the Photo Romance magazine. It has a soft cover and it is full of images from the romances that Paula contextualizes.
Yeah.
So
the images are so beautiful. It's worth reading only for the images.
It's a very beautiful book. There's a link in the chat as well.
Sorry, but this just remind me of the fact that much of the criticism also against the photo romance was that people like in the 70s especially, were arguing that because it's so visual, right? The audience, it's not very intellectually developed. And today that would be something completely absurd to us, right? Because we're so the viewership of television is so wide, right? We consume images every day, that we don't see that as something that diminish, right, our value as users, right? So sorry. That was just.
I mean, I might know a few intellectuals who don't own TVs who might agree with that as well. Most of us do watch television.
Right, but before, in the 70s, you'd be ashamed. Shaming was very strong in those years, so you would not say openly, right, that you would be a fan of photo romances, right? But today, we can very well say that we're a fan of TV series without any kind of worry, right, of coming out as fan.
Usually. Here's another note. Cara Paula, which other scholars have been most important to your work from, one, the perspective of methodology, and two, from that of scholarship on the photo romanzi themselves? How useful was Lucio Cardone's work on the photo romanzi? Thank you for the book and for this talk, Ellen O'Leary, Uni of Leeds, which we were just talking about. Leeds.
Yeah, I mean, as I said, Jan Baetens, I think, is my main reference among scholars that talked about the photo romanzi, the photo romances. Other scholars like Cardone, of course, yes, she's a scholar in especially the photo romance based on film. But for example, with that respect, one thing that I do is I try to, in the book, I try to connect. So as I said, I try to connect different fields and different approaches. So for example, in the case of the photo romances based on film, I look both at them as narratives, and that's what Cardone does for the most part, and as a fan magazine. And so the way in which they have this kind of twofold target, this twofold goal. On one end, yes, that of delivering narratives to an audience, so appealing them from that perspective, but on the other one, attracting fan fans of movie fans, right? By simply even just showcasing images from the film and portraits of actresses that people could cut out and, you know, save for their collection, right? So what I try to do is to connect, so as I said before, to look at the photoromas both as a text, as a medium that converge different other media, and as a product, as a media product that is grounded on a kind of industry that is based on synergies across media platforms.
Great, thank you. So we have a couple more questions. We have 5 minutes left, but I think we can do 2 questions in 5 minutes, because the last question I think is a yes or no answer. So the next question, I am curious about your take on photo romance and neorealism. Grazia Antonella. And it's from Antonella Pellizzari. I don't know if you know that person, but.
Yes, yes, she's a great scholar in photography. So yes, I know her. There is a connection. The image that I showed you before, right? The title of the photoromance was Dishonored. So the same way in which photoromances from the narrative perspective, they draw from pulp romances, they also draw from the neorealist tradition. And, you know, in those years, it was not a tradition because it was contemporary, right, to the photoromances. So in terms of narratives, there are connections. As I said, also the film photonovels, so those based on film, they were turning also so-called neorealist films. So I gave before very well kind of a controversial example of Vittorio De Sica, Terminal Station, then you have Fellini La Strada. So they were basically rewriting these films and popularizing them. Again, that kind of connection between the photoromance and the popular, right, in this sense, has connection with neorealism. But, you know, at the same time, as I said, these are product of industrial product, and therefore the products of entertainment. So they rewrite those kind of stories from the point of view of readership, and therefore not giving importance as much to the author, to the director, to the filmmaker, and giving much more importance to the needs and the expectation of the readership. And therefore, for example, they would change the narrative so that it would fit more the model of commercial cinema, in rewriting it, for example, in light of film melodrama, in finding the melodrama in neorealist film and exploiting that to make the product appealing to a popular audience.
Great. So the last question now is, are there plans to make your book available in Italian?
Oh, oh. I'm open to consideration. If you propose that, I'll be happy to.
Who would do the translating, you, or would you have someone else do it?
I could do it probably, yeah. I mean, I'm, you know, very flattered. I have to say that I wrote a book in English because I really thought that it was a story to be told to an international audience. You know, Italy is famous for the coffee, for the pizza. It should be famous for the photoromance. That was my intention, but definitely I would, you know, I would love to think that an Italian readership would also be interested in reading the book as well.
Yeah, before you know it, everyone will be reading a photo romance with their pizza on Fridays.
As a matter of fact, you know, language classes very often now they use photo romance as a way for teaching language, right? Because it's so easy to be handmade, precisely, like as opposed to, well, now films are also easy to be handmade, but as a medium, it's very open to grassroots kind of production, and therefore is used for that purpose too.
Yeah, definitely. I think that I've probably seen that in use that way before, yeah. But I didn't realize it was an entire medium or genre before. I might have just thought, oh, that looks nice.
I didn't say before, you know, but like in the 70s, for example, the Peace Corps, like groups like the Peace Corps would use the photoromance to educate like peasants. I don't know, I have an example of a book that was a book about how to make photoromances that was given to Peace Corps activists so that they could produce them for propaganda purposes, right? Because it's kind of a very easy medium to handle by anybody.
Definitely. So we are out of time, Paula. I'm so sorry. I wish I could talk to you all day. You have so much information, so much interesting information to share. But we do have a link to the book and places where you can find more information. So here we have, you can go to mitpress.mit.edu and you can find the book. But we also have a blog post on different ways to find the book during the pandemic. Fortunately, a lot of bookstores have opened and things are going back to normal, so you may not need that, but just in case. And then also, we are continuing to have MIT Press live events. We're not doing them weekly anymore, but we do have a page on our website. If you go to our homepage and scroll down to the bottom, you can see all of the MIT Press live events. And we will be posting a video of this event about a week from now. So stay tuned. And Paula, I will send you the video before it goes live.
Thank you.
All right, and it's been great having you here.
Thank you. It's been great to be here.
All right, and I'm hoping that everyone fancies themselves an expert on the photoromance now. All right, have a good day. Bye.
Bye.